Terry McAdams. The first case is Terry McAdams, a young woman who baked a heart-shaped cake on the night of February 13, 1985, and never lived to see Valentine's Day. For 39 years, the man who walked into her apartment had a name no one knew. Then, in 2024, a single distant cousin's DNA tied the entire story together. Terry Lynn McAdams was 22 years old. She was a University of Texas at Arlington student, the oldest of 3 sisters, originally from Arkansas. Her family described her as feisty and fun. She lived with her fiancé at the Walnut Ridge Apartments on Walnut Hill Circle in Arlington, Texas. In the months leading up to her death, she had become noticeably reclusive. She had become terrified by a string of abductions across the Fort Worth area that had spawned a regional task force, and she had even quit a job in Irving so that she would not have to drive home after dark. On the evening of February 13, 1985, Terry baked a heart-shaped Valentine's cake for her fiancé, who was out of town on business. She spoke to her sister on the phone. After they hung up, an intruder entered the apartment through the bedroom sliding glass door. Terry was harmed, beaten with a blunt object, and her engagement ring was taken. On the morning of February 14th, a maintenance worker at the complex made the discovery. Could anyone really walk through a sliding glass door, do all of that, and leave with no one having heard a sound? The early investigation produced a clear name. A 25-year-old Arlington area man named Bernard Sharp lived nearby. He had already been arrested twice on cases involving harm to women. Detectives interviewed him, but there was not enough physical evidence at the scene to connect him to Terry's apartment, and the file went cold. The case became one more piece of the panic spreading through the region. In 2021, Arlington police developed a male DNA profile through advanced testing. It was uploaded to CODIS, the national database. Nothing came back. Then in 2023, the department partnered with the FBI Dallas field office to begin investigative genetic genealogy. Agents took the unknown profile and uploaded it to public genealogy databases. The first hit came from a distant relative. From there, genealogists began building a family tree, cousin by cousin, generation by generation, until the branches led them to one name. Agents then obtained a confirmatory swab from a close, out-of-state relative. In August 2024, the UNT Health Science Center's Center for Human Identification confirmed the match. The man was Bernard Sharp, the same man who had been interviewed 39 years earlier and let go. He had been 30 years old when he killed Terry. He had a documented history of harm involving 2 other women. The detail that he had once been a known person to the original investigators and had simply slipped through for lack of physical evidence was almost difficult for Terry's family to absorb. And what investigators learned next made the silence of those 39 years even harder to carry. 9 months after Terry's death, on November 3, 1985, Bernard Sharp fatally shot his estranged wife, 29-year-old Denise Sharp, along with her 25-year-old friend, Deborah Delatorre. He critically wounded his wife's cousin during the same attack. He then turned the weapon on himself. By the time investigators ever uploaded a strand of his DNA to a public database, Bernard Sharp had been dead for 39 years. His name had been buried for nearly 4 decades, while Terry's name had remained an open file. No charges will ever be filed against him. Arlington Police Chief Al Jones acknowledged what every family of a cold case victim eventually faces. He said, "It would be easy to lose faith and accept that this case might never be solved." Terry's younger sister, Karen Hopper, stood at the August 14th press conference and said, I know that she and my mom and dad are smiling down on this miraculous moment. The case was later highlighted in Arlington Mayor Jim Ross's 2025 State of the City address. Police are now actively investigating whether Sharp harmed other women in the months between Terry's death and his own. While one Texas family finally received a name without a courtroom, another Colorado family had been waiting 4 decades for an arrest that genealogy would eventually deliver. Sylvia Quayle. The next case is Sylvia Quayle, a 34-year-old woman whose father walked across the yard for their daily morning coffee on August 4th, 1981, and never saw her again. For 40 years, the man who climbed through her bathroom window remained unknown. And the item that finally caught him was something he threw away in a dumpster. Sylvia May Quayle was a creative, deeply liked woman who lived a small, well-loved life. She'd graduated from Inglewood High School in Colorado and worked as a secretary at an architectural firm. On the side, she ran a small wedding cake business out of her home that she called The Buttery. Her sister Jo Hammett would later describe her as a wonderful person, full of life, happy, creative. Sylvia lived alone in a home on the 3800 block of South Ogden Street in Cherry Hills Village, roughly 150 feet from her parents, William and Mary Quayle. Every morning, she walked across the yard for coffee. On the night of August 3rd, 1981, Sylvia spoke on the phone with her younger sister around 11 o'clock. After they hung up, an intruder cut the telephone line outside her home. He pried open a bathroom window and removed its screen. What he did inside that house was so extreme that investigators struggled to make sense of it. Sylvia was shot once with a .22 caliber bullet in the top of her head, stabbed 3 times, strangled, and harmed. It was as if more than one person had taken turns. The next morning, when Sylvia did not arrive for coffee, her father, William, walked across the yard. He found her on the living room floor shortly before 8 a.m. The investigation took a strange turn early. In what would later be exposed as a stunning false confession, a drifter named Otis Toole, the partner of confessed serial killer Henry Lee Lucas, was formally charged with first-degree murder in 1983. Toole later recanted, and the case fell apart. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation developed a male DNA profile from the area rug in the year 2000. It was uploaded to CODIS. For 20 more years, nothing matched. Could one strand of DNA really sit in a database for 2 decades without ever finding the man it belonged to? In January 2020, the Cherry Hills Village Police Department partnered with a Denver-based firm called United Data Connect, co-founded by former Denver District Attorney Mitch Morrissey. The firm uploaded Sylvia's unknown profile to Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. By April 2020, genealogists had a person of interest. His name was David Dwayne Anderson, and in 1981, he had been a 21-year-old burglar living near Cherry Hills Village. He had been arrested twice on burglary charges in June 1981 alone, and again that October. But genealogy is only a lead. Investigators still needed his actual DNA to make a case in court. So a United Data Connect investigator traveled to Cozad, Nebraska, where Anderson was then living. They waited, they watched, and then a single discarded item gave them what 40 years of conventional policing had not. The investigator retrieved a vanilla Coke can Anderson had just dropped in the dumpster outside his apartment building. The DNA on the rim of the can matched the DNA from Sylvia's living room rug. A 40-year search had come down to a soda can pulled out of the trash. On February 10, 2021, David Dwayne Anderson was arrested in Nebraska. The arrest came 4 decades after the burglary records that should have placed him on every investigator's radar in the first place. His first trial in Colorado ended in a mistrial in March 2022. The second one did not. On June 30th, 2022, an Arapahoe County jury convicted him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. On August 4th, 2022, exactly 41 years to the day from the morning Sylvia's father found her on the living room floor, Anderson was sentenced to life in prison. Under 1981 sentencing law, he is eligible for parole after 20 years. District Attorney John Kellner spoke to reporters that day. He said, "When we first started our cold case unit in 2013, this is a case most people said would never be solved. But time and science march on. While one Colorado case ended in a courtroom, the next would carry an entire country's attention across 2 cities, 2 seasons, and 21 years of unanswered questions." Susan Tice and Aaron Gilmore. The next case stretches across 2 Canadian killings that sat side by side in evidence vaults for 40 years. 2 women, 1 city, 1 man hiding hundreds of miles north, and 1 piece of forensic science that no one in 1983 had ever imagined existed. What does it take to finally name a killer in a country that thought he had walked away forever? Susan Tice was 45 years old. She was a family therapist and a mother of 4. Her sons were named Ben, John, Christian, and Jason. Susan had moved to Toronto from Calgary only weeks earlier after separating from her husband, and she was just beginning to settle into her new life. Aaron Gilmore was 22. She was an aspiring fashion designer and the daughter of David Gilmore, a mining and Fiji water magnate who was the business partner of Peter Monk, the founder of Barrick Gold. Aaron lived above the boutique she had been working in Toronto's affluent Yorkville neighborhood. Susan was found on August 17, 1983. A relative had grown worried after not hearing from her and went to her home on Gray Street in Bickford Park. She had been harmed and stabbed 13 times, with clear defensive wounds on her hands and arms. 4 months later, on the night of December 20th, 1983, Aaron Gilmore was killed inside her Hazelton Avenue apartment above the boutique. She had been bound with a scarf and stabbed twice in the chest. Her body was discovered by a friend of her boyfriend, Sean McCowan, who had been delayed at a nearby ATM machine. The early investigation looked closely at the wealthy circles around the Gilmore family. Police even briefly examined Peter Monk's son. ATM records cleared him almost immediately. Years later, in 2000 and the following year, advances in DNA testing accomplished what investigators had long suspected. Both killings shared the same male DNA profile. The same man had been responsible for both. But who was he? Could one man really walk through downtown Toronto in 2 different seasons, harm 2 completely unrelated women, and leave nothing behind that pointed to a single neighborhood, a single workplace, a single name? In 2022, the Toronto Police Service partnered with Othram, a forensic lab in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram performed what is called forensic-grade genome sequencing on the preserved DNA. The work hit an obstacle no one had expected. The suspect appeared to have heavy First Nations ancestry, and Indigenous populations have historically been underrepresented in genealogy databases. The breakthrough required a different approach. The Toronto Police Service's in-house genealogist, James Atkinson, worked the family tree manually. He narrowed the lead to one specific family with 5 brothers living in Miosini, Ontario, a small town accessible only by train and aircraft on the southern coast of James Bay. Officers traveled north and began surreptitiously collecting discarded items from each brother in turn. Pop cans, a COVID mask. One by one, the brothers were cleared. And then one was not. Joseph George Sutherland was 61 years old when he was arrested on November 25, 2022. He was a Cree man, a member of the Fort Albany First Nation, and a survivor of St. Anne's Residential School, where he had himself been a victim. In 1983, he had been 21 years old and living in Toronto. The day after he provided a DNA sample to investigators, he confessed to a longtime ex-Ontario provincial police friend of his, a man named Kota. Sutherland pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder in October 2023. On March 22, 2024, Justice Maureen Forrestel sentenced him to life in prison with no eligibility for parole for 21 years. The trial judge said that the offenses came close to first-degree murder, even though the plea had been negotiated down. He is currently held at the Toronto South Detention Centre and will be eligible for parole consideration in 2043. For the 4 Tice sons and for Aaron Gilmore's family, the courtroom was the first time in over 4 decades that the man behind both 1983 killings sat in front of them with a name. The case was featured on Dateline NBC in an episode called Evil Walked Through the Door in April 2024. While one Canadian story closed inside a courtroom, the next would close around a man who had died in his own home 9 months before anyone ever spoke his name. Janet Love. The next case is Janet Love, a Delta Airlines ticket agent whose killer turned out to be living less than 1,000 feet from her front door. He had no known reason to know her. He had no documented connection to her, and for 35 years, no one even knew he existed. Janet Elaine Love was 32 years old. She was originally from Louisiana, and in 1985 she had moved to Bedford, Texas, a small suburb in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. She worked as a Delta Airlines ticket agent at DFW Airport, a job that placed her behind a counter speaking with passengers every day. She lived alone in an apartment on Eldon Dodson Drive in Bedford. Her colleagues at the airline counter were the people who saw her most often and the ones who first noticed when she did not appear. On the morning of April 24, 1986, Janet did not show up for work. That was not like her. 2 Delta co-workers grew concerned and went to her apartment. What they found inside is what defines this case. Janet had been harmed and shot in the head. The scene gave investigators DNA but did not give them a name. Could a woman really be killed inside her own apartment without a single neighbor seeing the man who left? Bedford police would chase this case for the next 3.5 decades. 15 detectives worked on it across 34 years. None of them ever got close enough to make an arrest. The DNA collected at the apartment was eventually entered into Codius when the database was first created, but nothing ever matched. Bedford Sergeant Brett Bowen would later describe what those years had felt like. He told reporters, "It wasn't unsolved because of lack of effort. We just needed science and technology to catch up." In 2020, the science finally arrived. A Texas Department of Public Safety Sexual Assault Kit Initiative grant, funded by the U.S. Department of Justice, gave Bedford police the resources they needed. The preserved samples from Janet's case were sent to the UNT Center for Human Identification in Fort Worth. A genealogist began building a family tree from the unknown DNA profile. 2 of the suspect's family members provided confirmatory kinship samples to investigators. The work narrowed and narrowed until it pointed to one man. In September 2021, after 35 years of dead ends, Bedford police finally had a name. It was Ray Anthony Chapa. In 1986, Ray Anthony Chapa had been a 19-year-old living in a neighboring apartment complex. The distance from his front door to Janet's apartment was less than 1,000 feet. He had a documented record of theft and drug possession at the time. but nothing on it suggested he was capable of what he did to Janet that morning. He had never appeared on any list of suspects. Detectives over 35 years had interviewed neighbors, co-workers, ex-boyfriends, and travelers from Janet's airline circle. They had never had a reason to knock on the door of the young man, one building over. Bedford Police Chief Jeff Williams summed up the shock to reporters. He said, "Chapa had no known ties to the victim and was never considered a suspect until DNA technology revealed the truth. He had simply been a stranger in a nearby building. After the killing, Chapa had not stayed in Texas. Investigators tracked his later movements through Illinois and Montana over the following decades, and they are now actively examining whether other unsolved cases in those states may also be connected to him." But Ray Anthony Chapa would never face a Bedford courtroom. He had died in January 2021, 9 months before genealogists ever identified him. His own family had not known what he had done. When investigators informed them, his sister Rebecca Roberts told Fox 4 News that the timing, painful as it was, brought a strange kind of relief to the relatives who survived him. She said, "It's probably best that he's not alive, and that our family doesn't have to go through a trial." For the Love family, the answer arrived without an arrest, without a sentence, and without a courtroom moment. While one Texas case closed with a death certificate instead of a verdict, the next would do something almost impossible. It would carry a man across the U.S. border 37 years after he killed his own sister-in-law. Barbara Villarreal. The final case in this section is Barbara Villarreal, a Garland, Texas woman whose killer hid in plain sight inside her own family. For 37 years, he walked among the relatives at funerals and gatherings. He aged, he visited, he celebrated birthdays. And one of those celebrations is exactly what brought him home. Barbara Faye Villarreal, whose maiden name was Carr, was 37 years old. She and her husband lived in a home on the 3600 block of Colbath Street in Garland, a Dallas suburb. The couple had no children. Her mother would still be alive nearly 4 decades later, 93 years old by the time investigators finally explained what had happened in Barbara's home. On November 7th, 1986, Barbara was found inside that home. She had been stabbed with a large kitchen knife found near her. Investigators noted something at the scene that ultimately became the most important detail of the entire case. There was blood in the home that did not belong to Barbara, and it did not belong to her husband either. Someone else had bled inside the house that day. Her husband was interviewed extensively in the days after the killing. He was cleared by DNA testing once samples became viable for comparison. The case took a strange turn shortly afterward, when, in 1988, Barbara's husband was killed in a shootout in Mexico, removing the most natural living witness investigators had ever had. The blood profile collected at the Colbath Street scene was eventually uploaded to CODIS once the database became operational. There was no match. The FBI followed leads on both sides of the U.S. border throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. Years stretched into decades. Could whoever bled inside that home really have disappeared completely? The answer was finally pulled out of the same family Barbara had married into. Through the Dallas County District Attorney's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative Cold Case team, genealogist Cheryl Hester of Advanced DNA began building family trees from cousin matches in public genealogy databases. The branches grew, intersecting one another, until they brought investigators to a single name. The trees did not point to a stranger. They pointed back to Barbara's husband's side of the family. Liborio Canales was Barbara's brother-in-law. By 2023, he was 84 years old and living in Mexico. He had spent decades on the other side of the border, well aware that crossing back into the United States would expose him to the same fingerprinting and biographical checks that any traveler faces at a port of entry. For 37 years, he had stayed safely away from Texas, never returning, never risking the family events that might bring his name into a database. And then, in July 2023, he crossed back into the United States. Investigators say he wanted to celebrate his 85th birthday with family in New Mexico. He was apprehended in Lovington, New Mexico, and brought back to Dallas County to face charges in Barbara's killing. Liborio Canales told investigators that he had stabbed Barbara during what he described as a family argument inside her home. On March 12, 2024, Canales pleaded guilty in Dallas County. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. At 86 years old, the sentence was effectively a life one. His conviction also marked something historic for Texas. It was the first murder conviction ever secured in Dallas County through investigative genetic genealogy, opening a doorway for hundreds of other cold case files sitting on shelves across the state. At the sentencing hearing, Barbara's sister-in-law, Jennifer Dunderman, turned in the courtroom and addressed Canales directly. She told him, "The life you lived should be considered a gift. You didn't just kill Barb. You killed a little piece of everyone she knew." For nearly 40 years, Barbara's family had eaten dinners with the man who had killed her. They had attended weddings with him. They had aged alongside him without knowing what he was carrying. And if you have made it this far and enjoy content like this, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. While one Texas family discovered the killer had been sitting at their table for 40 years, the next case would prove that even a 40-year-old name from inside a small police file could finally be confirmed by science. Laura Kempton. The next case is Laura Kempton, a young Canadian woman who walked back to her apartment in Portsmouth, New Hampshire one September night and never made it to bed. For 41 years, her killer's identity sat just outside the reach of every database investigators tried. Then, a cigarette butt, an autopsy blood card, and a single overlooked burglary file finally pulled the answer into the open. Laura Kempton was 23 years old. She had been born on Prince Edward Island, Canada, and had crossed the border to study at the Portsmouth Beauty School. To pay her way, she worked at both a local gift shop and an ice cream parlor. According to the New Hampshire Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, friends and associates described her as an outgoing, free spirit with a big personality and a love for new wave fashion. She lived alone in a small apartment on Chapel Street, a quiet stretch in the historic part of Portsmouth. In the early morning hours of September 28, 1981, Laura returned home alone after a night out. What happened over the next several hours was discovered almost by accident. Portsmouth police officer Ron Grivois walked to Laura's door later that day. He was attempting to serve a routine parking violation summons. What he found instead changed Portsmouth forever. The front door of the apartment had a panel missing, kicked out from the outside. Laura's legs were bound with a cord. Blood was spattered on the far wall. She had been harmed, and her cause of death was determined to be massive trauma to the left side of her head, most likely from a glass wine bottle found at the scene. The early investigation chased a long list of leads, hundreds of them. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office described that period in plain language. In the years that followed, investigators pursued hundreds of leads and potential suspects, but were unable to identify the perpetrator. Detectives were also partly distracted by suspected links to the death of another Portsmouth Beauty School student named Tammy Little, who had been killed in a similar manner roughly a year later. The two cases became intertwined in the public's mind. The actual evidence, it would later turn out, never linked the two. Then in 2022 came the turning point. Could a glass bottle, a cigarette butt, and a pillow really still carry usable DNA after 41 years? The Portsmouth Police Department, the New Hampshire and Maine State Police Labs, the Attorney General's Cold Case Unit, and a forensic genealogy firm called Identifinders International all came together on the file. Samples were drawn from the cigarette butt, the pillow, and the glass bottle that had been preserved in evidence. A workable DNA profile emerged. Genealogists began the slow process of building a family tree backward from cousin matches in public databases. By June 2023, the tree had narrowed to one name. To confirm it, investigators turned to an autopsy blood card that had been preserved long after the suspect's death. The samples were a direct match. The man was Ronnie James Lee. In 1981, he had been 21 years old. He had served in the United States Army until May of that year, and had then taken a job as a security guard at Liberty Mutual in Portsmouth, working from June 1981 through August 1982. He had no known acquaintance with Laura, but what investigators found inside his post-1981 record made the omission of his name all the more painful. Between 1982 and 1983, he had been linked to 4 residential burglaries and 1 commercial burglary in the Portsmouth area. In 1987, Ronnie James Lee was convicted of a burglary in Keene that included a sexual assault on a woman who had been home at the time. Ronnie James Lee died of acute cocaine intoxication on February 9, 2005, at age 45 in Manchester, New Hampshire. By the time genealogists ever uploaded his DNA profile, he had been gone for nearly 2 decades. Attorney General John Formella announced the case solved on July 20, 2023. He told reporters that if Lee were still alive, he would have charged Lee with first-degree murder. While one New Hampshire family closed a chapter that had been left open for 4 decades, the next case would expose something far darker than a single killing. It would reveal a serial predator who died before anyone realized how many he had taken. Pamela Maurer and Deborah Colliander. The next case ties together 2 women whose stories sat in different counties, different decades, and different files for almost half a century. One was 16 and walking out for a soft drink. The other was a kidnapping victim who had escaped naked from her attacker's home, only to disappear days before testifying against him. What kind of man does it take to be at the center of both? And how was it possible that he died with neither answer ever being attached to his name? Pamela Maurer was a junior at Downers Grove South High School in Woodridge, Illinois. On the night of January 12, 1976, she left a friend's house in nearby Lisle to walk to a store and pick up a soft drink. The next day, a motorist driving down a quiet stretch in DuPage County saw something in the grass off College Road and Maple Avenue. It was Pamela. She had been placed just outside a guardrail in a deliberate arrangement to make it look like a hit-and-run accident. She had been harmed and strangled, most likely with a rubber hose found nearby. 4 years later, in 1980, a young woman named Deborah Colliander was abducted from a shopping center in Aurora. She was taken to a private home where she was harmed. What she did next was extraordinary. She escaped from the house naked and ran to a neighbor for help. Investigators arrested the man who had taken her. He was charged. He posted bail. And then, days before she was set to testify against him in court, Deborah vanished. Her body was not found for 2 more years. In 1982, a farmer in Oswego Township discovered her in a shallow grave. Her cause of death could not be determined. It was ruled a homicide. The man Deborah had escaped from was named Bruce Lindahl. He had multiple prior charges involving harm to women, but no convictions. and he was no longer alive to face anyone. Could two unrelated cases really circle the same man, without anyone in either jurisdiction ever connecting them? In 2001, a DNA profile was developed from Pamela Maurer's body. Investigators uploaded it to CODIS. There was no match. Bruce Lindahl had already been dead for 20 years by then. There was nothing in any system to compare him against. The breakthrough came in 2019, when DuPage County prosecutors partnered with the forensic genealogy firm Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon produced a detailed phenotype profile, a description built from the DNA itself, suggesting hair color, eye color, and other physical features. Then they began building a genealogical family tree. The tree pointed back to one Aurora area man. In November 2019, prosecutors took the unprecedented step of obtaining a court order to exhume Bruce Lindahl's body. The DNA match was confirmed at a strength of 1 in 1.8 quadrillion. On January 13, 2020, DuPage County prosecutors announced the result. It was Illinois' very first murder solved by investigative genetic genealogy. Bruce Lindahl had been 23 years old in 1976. He had died in 1981 at 28, under circumstances that read almost like a parable. He had been in the act of stabbing an 18-year-old Waubonsie Valley High School student named Charles Huber Jr. 28 times when he accidentally severed his own femoral artery. He bled to death on the floor beside his victim. The end of his own life, in a way, ensured that he would never face an arrest for anything that had come before it. What investigators found inside Lindahl's old home suggests Pamela was not the only case he should answer for. Police recovered photographs of Deborah McCall, a Downers Grove North student who had been missing since November 1979. DuPage prosecutors also now believe Lindahl arranged Deborah Colliander's killing through a roommate of his, possibly offering the man money and drugs in exchange for silencing her before she could testify. The roommate later admitted to investigators that Lindahl had in fact made such an offer at the time. Detective Chris Loudon said it plainly to reporters. He said, "I suspect him to be a serial killer." The tip lines remain open. While one Illinois investigation rewrote the file on a man already in the ground, the next case would bring a similar resolution to a Kansas City family who had spent 31 years suspecting the answer was someone they already knew. Fawn Cox. The next case is Fawn Cox, a teenager who came home from work at an amusement park on a hot July night and went straight to bed. For 31 years, her family clung to a theory about a neighborhood gang. The truth, when it arrived, was something far quieter and something far closer to her own front door. Fawn Cox was 16 years old. She lived in a two-story home near 9th Street and Van Brunt Boulevard in the northeast neighborhood of Kansas City, Missouri. She lived there with her parents and her two sisters, including her younger sister Felisa. To help her family financially, Fawn had taken a job at Worlds of Fun amusement park. She attended church every Sunday. She was, by every account from people who knew her, exactly the kind of young person every parent hopes a daughter will turn out to be. On the night of July 26, 1989, Fawn came home from her shift at Worlds of Fun. It was around 11 o'clock. The house was hot, and her bedroom on the upper floor had no air conditioning, so she had cracked her window open before going to sleep. Outside the home, a trailer had been parked near the wall, just close enough to give someone with bad intentions a step up. According to court records, the intruder climbed onto that trailer, reached the upper window, and entered Fawn's bedroom. She was harmed and strangled in her own bed. Electronics from the room were taken. The next morning, Fawn's mother and her younger sister Felisa found her after her alarm clock would not stop ringing. The original investigation chased something almost everyone in the neighborhood had been talking about. Kansas City police pursued a theory involving a local group of teenagers known as the 9th Street Dog Gang. 3 teenagers were charged based on witness testimony. One of them was held in custody for 8 months. But the case quickly began to fall apart. The DNA testing came back inconclusive, and the key witness recanted. The teens were eventually released. Fawn's case dropped into the limbo where cold cases live. Could the wrong answer really have hung over a Kansas City neighborhood for 3 full decades? The break came from federal funding. In 2020, an initiative called Operation Legend brought FBI resources into the Kansas City area. Those resources paid for advanced genetic genealogy testing on samples of semen that had been preserved from Fawn's bedding for 31 years. Within weeks, genealogists had something the original detectives had never had. The family tree they built from public databases led them in a direction no one had ever investigated. It led them to Fawn's own cousin. His name was Donald Cox, Jr. In 1989, he had been 21 years old, about 5 years older than Fawn. He had a record of minor offenses, including theft and drug possession. But nothing in that record suggested what investigators now knew he had done. He was a family member who had been in and out of the house, who had attended events with the Coxes, and who had simply blended into the background of every family gathering. To confirm the match, investigators did not need to dig anyone up. Donald Cox Jr. was already dead. In 2006, he had died from an overdose under circumstances that had at the time looked suspicious enough to prompt an investigation, although foul play was ultimately ruled out. After his death, the medical examiner had preserved a blood sample. That sample, sitting on a shelf for 14 years, was now compared directly to the DNA from Fawn's bedding. The match was direct. Kansas City police announced the case solved on November 11th, 2020. It was the department's first cold case solved through investigative genetic genealogy. Fawn's sister, Felisa Cox, spoke to reporters about the strange weight of receiving an answer they had never thought they would get. She said, "It's a relief there's closure. The answers aren't always what we were asking for. But there's closure." Family members later admitted that some of them had quietly wondered about Donald for years, but no one had ever said it out loud. While one Missouri family received an answer that lived inside their own bloodline, the next case would prove that sometimes the original investigators had the right name all along. They just needed the science to prove it. Joette Smith. The next case is Joette Smith, a Northern California restaurant owner whose name the original lead investigator had known since 1988. For 34 years, that name sat in his case file without enough evidence to support an arrest. And then, in 2022, one preserved dress finally closed everything. Joette Marie Smith was 33 years old. She had been born in 1949 in Omaha, Nebraska, and was the eldest of 7 children in a Polish Catholic family. She had graduated from St. Albert's High School in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and attended St. Benedict's College in Atchison, Kansas. In 1973, she had moved to Boulder Creek, California. By 1983, she had been the proprietor of a small Ben Lomond restaurant called Buffalo Gals for nearly 8 years. The place served organic food, hosted live music, and had a grandma's parlor atmosphere that locals adored. She lived in a small studio on Hillside Avenue, directly across from her own restaurant, with a roommate named Rachel Devereaux. Her sister Annette Anderson would later say of her, "Joette was the fun one. She was definitely a hippie, so much fun, always joking. On the night of March 27, 1983, Joette and Rachel ate popcorn together and watched the Thornbirds on television. After Rachel went to bed around 11 o'clock, Joette stepped out to buy cigarettes. She was last seen at roughly 11:50 p.m. at Henfling's Tavern. She bought a pack of cigarettes, received 50 cents in change, and turned down a ride home from a female bartender. She told the bartender that it was a pleasant evening and that she would walk. She never made it home. Around 11:10 a.m. on March 29th, a man walking his dog found her body. She had been caught on a tree limb in the San Lorenzo River, near the 200 block of North Woodland Drive. She was wearing only pearls, one nylon stocking, one black boot, and a ring. She had been harmed and strangled. Investigators determined that she had been attacked under a bridge roughly 50 feet from her own studio. She had nearly made it. The original investigation gathered evidence, but never assembled enough of it. Then, in 1988, 5 years after Joette's death, an out-of-state inmate volunteered the name Eric Drummond, who had also gone by Eric Johnson. The inmate said Drummond had asked Joette out and been rejected only days before her death. The name went into the file. Detectives looked into him, but without physical evidence connecting him to the river or to her studio, no charges could be brought. The lead sat for 34 years. Could a name really live inside a folder that long without anyone being able to prove it? In 2022, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office Forensic Services Division reopened the file with the California Department of Justice DNA Laboratory. They pulled out an item that had been quietly preserved since 1983. It was the dress Joette had been wearing the night she died. From it, lab technicians recovered a male DNA profile. The profile was uploaded to CODIS. There was no match. But unlike many of the other cold cases of the same era, investigators did not need a genealogy database. They had a name already on file. In August 2022, they obtained a direct DNA swab from Eric David Drummond. The lab confirmed it. The man identified by an inmate in 1988 had been the right man all along. Eric David Drummond, 64 years old in 2022, had been a janitor at a bar near the river. He had lived in a small rental in the back of the building, putting him within walking distance of where Joette was attacked. His record included prior convictions in California and Nevada, a 1983 prison stint for attempted homicide in Redding, and a 4-year sentence in 1988 for a violent assault in Nevada. He had left California abruptly after Joette's death. Before deputies could obtain a warrant, Drummond ended his own life in early September 2022 in Sierra County, California. The sheriff's office announced the case solved on September 14, 2022. Joette's sister Yvette Smith-Nixick said quietly to reporters, "I was never wanting to see him in court. It's closure." While one California case closed without a courtroom, the final case on this list would cross an international border, reach a graveyard in West Virginia, and bring a name to a Montreal mother who had been waiting almost half a century. Sharon Pryor. The final case is Sharon Pryor, a Montreal teenager who left her house on a Saturday evening in 1975 to meet her boyfriend at a pizzeria. She never arrived. The man who took her would die 7 years later in a different country, and his name would not be known for another 4 decades. How does a killer slip out of an entire province and stay hidden until DNA finally reaches him underground? Sharon Pryor was 16 years old. She lived with her family in the working-class Pointe Saint-Charles neighborhood of Montreal. Her mother, Yvonne, would still be alive when the case was finally solved. 85 years old by the time investigators reached her with a name. On the evening of March 29, 1975, Sharon left home around 7 o'clock to meet her boyfriend and a group of friends at a pizzeria on Wellington Street. The walk should have taken her only minutes. She never made it. By 11 that night, her mother had called the police. 3 days later, on April 1st, 1975, her body was found in a vacant wooded lot in Longueuil, across the St. Lawrence River from her own neighborhood. She had been harmed, beaten, and suffocated. At the scene, investigators found tire tracks and a man's t-shirt that had been used to restrain her. The early investigation moved through one piece of information that should have helped. Around the same time, a 22-year-old woman in Montreal reported that a tall, English-speaking man with blue eyes, brown hair, and a mustache had attempted to abduct her at knife point on Wellington Street. The description was clear, but despite intense media coverage that called the unknown killer a monster, the Longueuil police investigated 122 named suspects across nearly 5 decades without ever identifying the right one. The t-shirt at the scene held DNA, but in 1975, no laboratory in the world could pull it out. Investigators kept it preserved. They waited. Could a single shirt really survive almost 50 years and still hold an answer? In June 2022, advances in DNA technology finally allowed investigators to develop a usable profile from the t-shirt. They uploaded it to public genealogy databases. The work pointed away from Quebec entirely. It pointed across the U.S. border to the Romine family of Charleston, West Virginia. The tree narrowed to 4 brothers there. Final laboratory processing was completed at Quebec's National Forensic Facility, the Laboratoire de Sciences Judiciaires et de Médecine Légale, known as the LSJML. Sarah Bourgoin, director of the Biology and DNA department at the lab, later explained the moment to reporters. She said, "We were able to establish a genetic profile by comparing it to the unknown profile in Sharon Pryor's case. We remarked that it was identical, which confirmed that it was indeed Franklin Romine who left his DNA at the scene." Longueuil detective Eric Racicot then went back and checked old records. Franklin Maywood Romine had held 2 known addresses in the Montreal and Longueuil area in 1975. To finalize the match, investigators turned to a graveyard. In early May 2023, Romine's body was exhumed from Pine Grove Cemetery in Putnam County, West Virginia. On May 23, 2023, the DNA was confirmed. Franklin Maywood Romine had been born on April 2, 1946, in Huntington, West Virginia. He had an extensive criminal record, including a prior rape conviction in Parkersburg. In the months before Sharon's death, he had actually been caught at the Canadian border and extradited back to West Virginia to serve a 5 to 10-year sentence. After his release, he had crossed back into Canada and resumed living in Montreal. He matched the physical description given by the Wellington Street kidnapping survivor. His vehicle was compatible with the tire tracks left at the scene. He had died in Verdun, Montreal, in 1982 at age 36. Under circumstances no death certificate has ever been located to explain. Sister Doreen Pryor addressed reporters after the announcement. She said, "Knowing that her killer is no longer on this earth and cannot kill anymore brings us to somewhat of a closure." Sister Maureen added that the family was still grieving the loss of the daughter and sister they had loved for so long. No prosecution will ever take place. But for Yvonne Pryor, who had waited from age 35 to age 85, a name had finally been spoken aloud after almost half a century of silence. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.